Welcome to the Tudor Travel Show. It's Sarah here, the Tudor Travel Guide, and it's great that you're joining me again. So here at the end of January, I've been busy writing all month about Mary Queen of Scots on the blog. And so it's been really fascinating for this programme to talk to a couple of people who know a thing or two about Mary, the places that she's been associated with, and indeed one of the artefacts said to be associated with her. So first of all, we're going to be hearing from Kieran Rose from Borthwick Castle, a place that Mary is said to have stopped at on 3 occasions, including her flight from Scotland. And then we're going to be talking to Philippa Turner from Coton Court in Warwickshire, a house of the Throckmorton family, a Catholic family, where there is said to be a smock that Mary Queen of Scots wore to her execution. And I'll be quizzing Philippa about the provenance of that particular article. And then finally, I'm going to be talking to fellow blogger Rebecca Larson from Tudors Dynasty about her absolutely favourite Tudor place. So once again, we've got another packed show, and I look forward to taking you on our next Tudor journey. And so let's get stuck in straight away, and let's talk to Kieran Rose from Borthwick Castle. So hello Kieran, welcome to the Tudor Travel Show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you.
And of course, we are going to be talking about Borthwick Castle. Now, you're the front of house manager at Borthwick. So tell me, how do you know so much about the castle? What's the story there, Kieran?
Well, I've been at Borthwick Castle for almost 2 years now, and just over a year ago, the owners asked me to be in charge of the history. Now, what that involves on a day-to-day basis is doing history tours, not just for our guests that come and stay at the castle, but also for any tourists that may happen to come by the castle.
Uh-huh.
So I decided that I needed to do a lot more research into it. Up until then, we just mostly went on sort of word of mouth from previous owners and members of staff, as well as whatever we could find online on Google. So I decided to head up to the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh City Centre, as well as in Dalkeith Library, which is a local town close to Borthwick, which has all the details about the local towns and villages in the county. Mm-hmm. So I spent a lot of hours looking through all these old artefacts and old books, and basically looking for any little bits of knowledge that we could find out about the castle. So I would say that from that research, we've probably tripled what we actually knew about the castle in total.
Well, that's fantastic, isn't it? And the dreaded Google Chinese whispers are brought to an end. So that's wonderful.
Absolutely, and I think it really helps that I have an interest in the history itself.
Okay.
It's made it quite enjoyable for me, and there's that sort of thirst for knowledge has made sure that I've gone out my way to try and find out the real story, as opposed to any sort of gossip or hearsay.
Oh, yeah, good. Well, so you're our man. So it's wonderful you're talking to us today, and of course Borthwick is associated with a number of well-known personalities, but there's one in particular, of course, and that's Mary Queen of Scots. And I suppose that's where we're going to focus our attention today, to think about the castle during the 16th century and about its association with Mary. And to give us a little bit of context, can you just explain to us, how that relationship came about? Why did Mary end up at Borthwick?
Absolutely, yes. So Mary, that we know of, visited the castle on 3 different occasions, 1563, 1566 and 1567. Now, the third and final time it was probably the most crucial and interesting as well. Mm-hmm. It was June 1567. She had not long married her third husband, James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, and it wasn't a particularly popular decision. He wasn't a particularly well-liked person in the time. And a lot of people were starting to gradually turn against Mary or not really quite having full support for their queen anymore. So, for example, whenever she was calling her lords to come to court at Holyrood Palace to see her, a lot of them were making excuses and not showing up. She decided, therefore, to try and sort of get away from Edinburgh, to get away from the heat, if you like, to get away from it all for a while. And so it made sense to come to Borthwick Castle because geographically, the way the crow flies, it's only 12 miles from the Royal Mile, from Holyrood Palace. Also, politically, it made sense because Lord Borthwick was actually one of the last few allies that she really had.
Oh, I see.
Also, Borthwick Castle is, if you ever see it, very much a defensive keep as opposed to a palatial castle. So it is very good for defensive purposes. The walls do go up to 15 feet thick down in the basement level. Even at the top level of the garrison, they're up to 8 feet thick.
Wow.
And they are completely thick all the way through. They're not hollow in any way. So it made sense for a lot of different reasons for her to come. So that's what she did with her third husband, Bothwell, in tow. When they were here, after a few days, a few of the insurgent lords came with 1,000 troops and demanded that they both handed themselves over to head back into Edinburgh for questioning. Now, this was mostly for questioning for the death of her second husband, Lord Darnley, who had died suspiciously. And naturally...
How much earlier had that happened, the death of Lord Darnley?
So that had happened in early 1567.
Okay. So literally months then?
Yes, and she had moved on fairly quickly onto the Earl of Bothwell. So after they moved out here, they were confronted and they refused to hand themselves over. And Bothwell actually escaped. And sadly, we don't know exactly how he escaped, but he did escape from Borthwick. And being the gentleman that he was, he left Mary here on her own.
What a chivalrous kind of guy.
Oh, yes, indeed. And actually, what she then did a day or two later was she disguised herself as a page boy, so as a servant boy. And she actually escaped from one of the windows in the Great Hall. It's actually only a few metres from where I'm sitting just now.
Is that so? Wow.
And from there, she was lowered down on a rope onto horseback. And from there, she fled to a place called Dunbar, which is in East Lothian. And she rejoined Bothwell there. And after that, they then sort of gradually made their way through East Lothian, trying to build an army as they went, heading back into Edinburgh. Now, they got as far as a place called Carbery, which isn't too far from Edinburgh. It's just very much on the outskirts. And there they were confronted again by the insurgent lords. The Earl of Bothwell, being the very lucky person that he was, somehow managed to escape yet again and made his way to Norway. Although it has to be said that he did later get captured there and was incarcerated there and went senile and died over there. Yes, he had quite a
grisly end, didn't he, really?
He did, and it's actually very difficult to be too sympathetic towards him.
It is, really.
Particularly as a Scotsman for what he or how he treated Mary, our Queen. Yeah. But Mary, on the other hand, again, very unlucky. She was captured and taken by the insurgent lords. They took her back into Edinburgh, where most of the people had turned on her. You can almost imagine them walking up the Royal Mile with her as they throw sort of rotten veg at her as she was chained up.
Was she chained up? She was actually chained at that point?
She most likely would have been, yeah. It certainly would have been the sort of easier way. They definitely didn't want to lose her, that's for sure. And so presumably any effort at all that could have been made, they would have. After that, they decided it was best to get her out of Edinburgh. Mary was taken from Edinburgh to Loch Leven. Loch Leven is in Kinrossshire in Scotland. It's just north of Edinburgh and Fife. Probably the closest place of note that people would know to it is St Andrews. Now, Loch Leven is obviously a loch. It has an island in the very middle with a castle on it. Now, the castle's still there. It is an old ruin. It's run by Historic Scotland and can still be visited by boat during the summer months. But that's where she was kept to begin with, and spent several months there. People did try to help her escape from there. Without success, she was caught. However, the powers that be decided that, in actual fact, the best thing was to get her out of Scotland. So what followed then was various stays in castles south of the border. Sheffield and Carlisle being probably two of the most notable. And then finally she was in Fotheringhay Castle. And of course that's where she finally met her demise. On the orders of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, she was beheaded. So she spent 19 and a half years of her life incarcerated.
It's incredible,
and was then
isn't
finally
it?
beheaded. It's remarkable. So almost half of her life. She was in her mid-20s when she was at Borthwick, and then mid-40s when she was finally beheaded. Okay. So an extraordinarily long time, especially back in those days where, you know, the length of life wasn't particularly long.
No, indeed. I mean, what an incredibly sort of tragic story. Yeah. Of a very romantic figure, I always think.
Absolutely. And what's really remarkable for Mary at Borthwick Castle is actually within about 2 weeks of leaving the castle, she was then incarcerated for the rest of her life.
So Borthwick really was one of the last places that she physically knew freedom.
Yes, absolutely, and it was even recorded in a letter, a long lost letter now, which she sent to the Bishop of St Andrews of the time when she was in Loch Leven Castle on the island. She wrote to him and said that Borthwick was actually one of the last places where she felt truly safe and happy. Oh.
So even more poignant. And if I can actually, Kieran, bring you back to talk a little bit about the castle itself, because I was actually very fortunate in that I did visit Borthwick Castle. It must have been about 15 years ago now when it was run on a bed and breakfast basis, but I remember it being impossibly romantically beautiful, very rugged countryside, and this very dominant looking central tower which really does dominate the surrounding landscape. I suspect nothing much has changed since then.
No, remarkably, still very much the same from the outside. Not a lot has changed. And yes, it is a defensive keep. It is very stark, and it certainly does stick out in the middle of all the greenery in this countryside in Midlothian. The inside, however, I would say is very, very different. When the current owners took over in 2013, they actually closed it down and did a full refurbishment for 2 years. So it was just reopened at the end of 2015. And slightly different from the bed and breakfast way that it was before, it's now a private exclusive use venue. So what that means is basically if someone wants to come and stay, they have to take the whole place. They get the whole place as opposed to just one room.
How completely amazing.
Yes.
And inside, though, I mean, the actual structure and layout of the rooms is pretty much as it would have been during Mary's day, isn't it? The same kind of entrance, great hall, layout of the principal chambers of the
Absolutely,
castle.
Yeah. So much of it is the same. The interior designer, when she was doing it a few years ago, decided that they wanted to go for a sort of authentic look. So it would look as as close as possible to how it may have looked back then. So although we have the super fast Wi-Fi and the plasma televisions in every room, they are hidden. You can't see these things. There's telephones, of course, in every room too, but again, you cannot see these things. However, what you will see is in place of the lights most often is a candle effect or lantern effect. There's a lot of tapestries as well. We tried not to go too heavy on the tartan. There's not a lot of tartan. We thought maybe that was just a little bit too fanciful and obvious. But it does look as authentic as it possibly could. Basically, as close as it may have looked back then.
And I wonder if we could go on a little journey, almost if you could... Obviously, we're talking here on the radio, but if you could take me on a little journey. So I enter the castle by going up a flight of stone stairs, don't I? And then directly into the Great Hall.
That's right, yes. So the stairs actually are one of the more modern features. They were built in the late 1890s by the current Lord Borthwick's great-grandfather. Now, we don't know if there was stone steps before then. In actual fact, what's most likely is it would have been some sort of wooden structure, a scaffolding of sorts. And basically that was in case anyone was attacking. If they managed to get within the curtain walls, all the people defending the castle would have to do is set it alight or dismantle it, and it would have prevented easy access into the castle.
They think about everything. They thought about everything, those...
They did. It's remarkable. It's remarkable how they really planned all these little details for defending.
Yeah, amazing.
But certainly, as you were saying, coming up the steps, you go then into the Great Hall. The kitchen's on the right-hand side. Interestingly, the kitchen has always been in that same position. But you go straight ahead into the Great Hall. As you look straight ahead on the south wall, there is a huge fireplace. That was quite badly damaged in the time that the castle was empty. Interestingly, after Oliver Cromwell's damage to the eastern wall, the cannon damage, the castle lay dormant for 240 years.
Yeah, so we should say
1890.
We probably should say that yes, Oliver Cromwell found his way right up to Borthwick and laid siege to the castle, and there are some scars on the wall of the castle. Tell us a little bit about that story. I don't believe the siege lasted for very long.
No, it didn't last long at all. Now, what happened actually is Oliver Cromwell had just sort of completed a 2-year tour of Ireland, fighting against any of the rebels, anyone that wasn't coming in line with English rule and London rule. And then in the summer of 1650, he came over to Scotland and did the same thing. Now, he spent 2 years in Scotland, and he was based for the early parts anyway in a place called Murray House, which is just off the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and it is now the education faculty of the University of Edinburgh. Now, from there he wrote a trumpet to the Lord Borthwick. It was the 9th Lord Borthwick at the time, and he said to him along the lines of, if you do not surrender your home, your castle, then I will be forced to bend my cannon. It gave him 14 days to remove his belongings and his family and his staff and leave. The 9th Lord Borthwick refused to do this.
Right.
And at that point, Oliver Cromwell, then sent one of his most experienced generals called General Lambert with a selection of troops onto a hill which is just on the eastern side of the castle. And from there they fired a few cannons into the side of the building. Now, we know that more were fired because during the research that I did last year, it actually says in the church records that one just missed the church. Oof. So there is a church at the end of the driveway, so presumably one went askew to the left slightly and down what is now the driveway and just missed the church. However, if you look at the castle on the eastern side, the damage is very, very clear. It goes in probably about 2 feet. The indentations of the cannon damage. And now it looks very severe from there. However, the level that it's hit the castle is actually the garrison, the top level, and the walls there are 8 feet thick. Yes. So, in actual fact, surface damage.
Just a scar.
Yeah, exactly, yes. Now, what's very interesting, what we were saying earlier about how they thought of so much, even hundreds of years ago, when it came to defensive and attacking, is actually in one of the soldiers' diaries, one of Cromwell's soldiers, it actually says that they purposely targeted the garrison level because they knew that's where the majority of the troops were. And also, they saw a chimney on the top at that exact spot. And so therefore they thought that basically the walls would be easier to penetrate because of the chimney going up that wall.
Wow. Well, very, 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 very clever. Yes, they knew what they were doing. Well, we were talking, we went slightly off piece there, but we were talking about the Great Hall, which is this very large vaulted chamber, as you say, with this magnificent chimney at the high end. And then the window that Mary escaped out of is still there, you say? Yes,
the window's still there. We call it for short the MQS booth, the Mary Queen of Scots booth. We have a table there now, and very often if we just have couples here, then or a small group, they may sit and have dinner or any of their meals in this little booth now.
Wow.
But the window is still there. The window believed to be where Mary was lured from onto horseback.
And was she was helped by some very loyal servants. So did she actually, though, take off on her own? Do we know that? Or was she travelling with somebody? Did any of her ladies-in-waiting attend her?
Well, in the records it says that 5 or 6 troops went with her. Now, what we don't know is would it perhaps have been hers or Bothwell's, or could it have been Lord Borthwick's troops? That went from the castle with her.
Right, okay. And I suppose that flight would have been across country, really, quite rugged terrain.
Yeah, it would have had to have been in that period, in the 1500s and 1560s. Yeah, she would have basically had to go cross country by horse.
Yeah.
Now, for a queen, that doesn't sound particularly pleasant or nice, and it wouldn't have been. But I think one thing about Mary Queen of Scots is that she definitely had endurance. She definitely was a fighter.
Yes.
She had to do a lot of it in her short lifetime. And I think definitely one thing she would have had is the drive inside her to do these things, to escape.
Yeah, I agree completely. She was definitely a resilient lady. And going back into the Great Hall, what I'm also interested in knowing is I think, am I right in saying that to get up to Mary's private chambers, her bedchamber, there's a stone spiral staircase that takes you up to the second floor?
That's right, yes. We have 3 spiral staircases within the castle. So there is one which leads exactly from the Great Hall, the sort of southwest wall, or southwest stairway, going right up to Mary Queen of Scots' room. Now, her bedchamber is actually on the next level, which we now call the stateroom. Or it's just off the stateroom. And the stateroom has always been what it is now, a sort of reception room, a room for relaxing with a drink before or after dinner. Now, the only difference to it is actually the sort of top third of it, which was partitioned. And that was actually the anteroom to Mary Queen of Scots' bedchamber. Now, of course, although she stayed in it on the 3 occasions that we know of, it was also the main guest bedroom. So anyone invited down the centuries, down the decades, by any of the Lord Borthwicks, this is the main room which they more than likely would have stayed in.
So the principal state chamber would have been the main room, or the bed chamber?
The bed chamber itself,
yes.
So off the stateroom, there's actually 2 bedrooms, one at either side. One's called the Earl of Bothwell. Funnily enough, that's where he stayed when he was there. And, of course, the other being the Mary Queen of Scots' bed chamber. Again, that was where she stayed. So they were the 2 main guest rooms on that level. But interestingly, what I was saying about the anteroom, that was basically where she would have sat during the day with her ladies-in-waiting, doing tapestry. And into an alcove in the corner there, there's actually what was her chapel. So, of course, she was a very devout Roman Catholic. And wherever she went, she insisted on there being a chapel wherever she was, a place for prayer and privacy. And so you can actually still see the piscina for the holy water, which is carved into the stonework of the castle in that alcove.
How wonderful. And yeah, guests to your castle can enjoy all of these and stay in all of these rooms, can't they?
Yes, absolutely. So we have the gatehouse, just as you come through the gates at the curtain wall of the castle. And then we have another 10 bed chambers inside the castle. Mary Queen of Scots, of course, being one of them, and probably being one of the most popular ones.
Not surprisingly.
No.
I was curious, after Mary left Borthwick, did she leave anything behind? Were there any, sometimes these royal folk leave artefacts behind that become much treasured items. Did she leave anything behind, do we know?
Well, interestingly, there's nothing of note, and you can perhaps call me fanciful, but I'd like to believe that the way in which she left, sort of last minute, escaping, I'd like to think that things probably were left behind, but sadly there is no note of it. Interestingly, though, during the research last year, what was found was various artefacts that were kept in the castle during the Second World War. And one of the things was actually a tapestry, which it's believed that Mary made herself when she was in Loch Leven Castle.
Wow. Right, and then that is where now?
That's currently on display. I actually went up a couple of weeks ago to the National Museum of Scotland on Chambers Street in Edinburgh city centre, and had a look at it. It is on display.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I haven't visited Edinburgh for such a long time, but talking to you now is making me want to plan my next trip. Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we should just finish the story of the castle we talked a little bit about what happened during the English Civil War with Oliver Cromwell, but we should finish the story of the castle by just saying, what happened to it after that? You talked about it being empty for a period of time.
That's right. So once the cannons did hit the castle, Lord Borthwick realised that Cromwell was serious after all, and he agreed to surrender. Now, again, he was given 14 days to take his belongings and his staff and his family and leave. And that's exactly what he did. And he went down to some of the land that he had in the Scottish borders. Now, he died without an heir. And so that meant that there was no one there to replace him to someday, many years later, go back and claim the castle again. And so the castle lay virtually dormant for 240 years until 1891. I say virtually, it wasn't completely. There were a couple of different owners from the local village which used it. One used it as storage, as a quarry, basically, to store all his stone that he'd excavated from a local mine. Basically, people that didn't particularly look after it. Also, in that time, there were looters that took all the timber away from the inside of the castle, which is a real travesty, really. Yes. However, the current Lord Borthwick, his great-grandfather, came back in 1891. He was able to take ownership of the castle again. And what he found was, of course, a lot of work needed to be done. After 240 years of it being left to its own devices, there was a lot of various things. Now, interestingly, the massive fireplace that we have in the Great Hall, I have a drawing from 1906, which has a massive vacant space, a hole in the very middle of the fireplace. The story that goes with it is that a tree grew through it and it damaged the stonework that much that it fell away.
Wow.
And now there's actually carved in stone in front of it. It has been finished, and it has the date 1913.
Okay.
And the initials HB, Henry Borthwick. So that was one of the things. So it didn't just happen in 1891. It took a good 20 to 30 years for them to really get all the various parts done.
But it's amazing, though, isn't it? I mean, it's a testament to just how strong that building is, that it survived as it did for 200 years or so without very little attention from anybody.
Absolutely. It's incredible. And, it's not difficult in Scotland to get in the car and drive and just find all these old ruined castles.
Yeah.
There are so many of them. The ones that unfortunately didn't survive and didn't receive the sort of TLC that it needed, if you like. But this one, remarkably, to have gone that long, empty for all that time, and yet still survived and still been in a reasonable state where it could be inhabited again, is truly remarkable.
It is truly remarkable. So remind people, how might they inhabit the castle again? What are the possible options for them to maybe get inside or see inside?
Well, there's a few different things we do. We do, firstly, various dinners. Our head chef, Derek, he won the Master Chef on the BBC a few years ago, the very first one in 2008. And also, just a few months ago, came third place in the National Chef of the Year competition. So a very high pedigree, as you can imagine.
Lovely.
Now, he does various dinners, dining clubs we call them, throughout the year. And that's an opportunity for anyone that doesn't want to take the entire castle. They can come and have the dinner and the wine pairing with it, and they can take just one room if they like.
Lovely.
On top of that, of course, there is the private exclusive use year-round as well.
Yeah, and people can find you at, is it www.borthwickcastle.com?
That's it, yes. And on there are, of course, the contact phone numbers and email addresses.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. And I urge anybody who is able to try and steal a visit to Borthwick, because it still remains very much etched in my mind. It's such a wonderful and dramatic and romantic place, and so full of history. And I want to thank you, Kieran, for sharing all of that knowledge and the time you took to pull all that information together, that we can all enjoy the real facts associated with Borthwick. So thank you very much indeed.
You're more than welcome. An absolute pleasure to be on with you today.
So that was me talking to Kieran Rose, front of house manager for Borthwick Castle. And thanks to Kieran's recent research, we've been able to really get down to the truth of the events that unfolded at Borthwick. So I hope you enjoyed that, but now it's time for a little bit of music. And this piece is a short lute song by John Downland called Weep You No More, Sad Fountains. And so with the eponymous film, Mary Queen of Scots, recently released in the cinema, of course, there's been a lot of chatter on the Tudor sphere. And while I've been writing blogs on Borthwick Castle and Bolton Castle, and indeed Fotheringhay, where Mary met her sad end, I was minded of a visit that I'd made some years back to Coton Court in Warwickshire, and a particular artefact that they had there, and that was a chemise reputedly worn by Mary Queen of Scots at her execution. And I remember being fascinated by the faded blood stains around the neckline of the smock. And so I thought we would speak to the curator at Coton Court, Philippa Turner, and to hear what she had to say about this particular fascinating artefact. So hello, Philippa. Welcome to today's show. It's lovely to have you here as part of the curator's tale slot.
Well, hello, Sarah. It's lovely to be here and talking about Coton.
Yeah, you're most welcome. And I'm really looking forward to this because Coton's not too far away from where I live, but I haven't visited in a little time. So this will be a really great source of inspiration for me to come and visit next year. And I think prior to us talking today, I was mentioning the fact that there's a lot going on in the Tudor sphere at the moment about Mary Queen of Scots with the launch of the film. And I'm going to be doing quite a bit around Mary Queen of Scots in the blog. And I remembered last time I came to Coton that there was a chemise that is reputedly belonged to Mary Queen of Scots and that she wore at her execution. So I was really keen to chat to you today to find out a little bit more about that article.
Yes, it's one of many that we hold Catholic treasures from the Throckmorton family, because the Throckmortons were a prominent Catholic family and they're still a Catholic family today and are very proud of their religion.
And they've lived at Coton for how long, Philippa?
So we've had 20 generations of the Throckmorton family here. So they've been at Coton since 1409.
Wow.
So that's 6 centuries.
That's really, really mind-blowing, isn't it? And did they build the house that we see today, or was there an earlier medieval house before the current house was built? I'm just curious.
Yes, there was an earlier house, and then the current house is a Tudor house. So there have been additions over the years and changes to the facade, but the main house was built in the 16th century.
Okay. And of course, as you mentioned, the Throckmorton family, a Catholic family, and they've really had to weather, haven't they, the changes in the religious landscape, particularly during the Tudor period. But we may talk a little bit more about that, but let's just come to this garment, this chemise. So, Philippa, I remember visiting Coton and coming into the room and seeing the chemise in this glass case and, really being really fascinated by it. But perhaps you can just describe the garment for people.
So the chemise is made of fine linen with drawn thread borders and is inscribed on the bodice in red. And the inscription is in Latin, and it says, "Chemise of the most holy martyr, Mary Queen of Scots, who suffered under Elizabeth, Queen of England, 1587 Feb 18, which is around the date that she died." It's got full sleeves and it's full floor length with a square collar. It's quite a voluminous object. You would imagine that a shift might be quite fitted, but there's a lot of fabric going on with it.
Okay.
So it's quite an interesting object from just as a undergarment, really. It's one of 2 that survived from that period that tells us what people wore under their clothes in the Tudor times.
When was it first described as being at Coton Court?
So the 7th Baronet in 1820, Sir Charles Throckmorton, was given the chemise, and he writes in his diary, "Received yesterday as a present from William Sheldon of Gray's Inn, now here, a shift which is supposed to have belonged to Mary Queen of Scots."
Wow, that's amazing.
So,
and I take it that is the first sort of recorded provenance, the first kind of recorded existence of this particular chemise.
Yes, so we don't know when the chemise was inscribed. So there's a gap between 1587 and 1820 when Sir Charles received it. But obviously at some point somebody had attributed it to Mary Queen of Scots, and being attributed to the fact that she wore it when she died as well. So it's an even more evocative object.
And do we know anything of the person who gave it to Coat and Court? Anything more about his background or history, or is he quite a shady character?
I think he was associated with Charles Throckmorton, but we don't have any information on him as yet. We can always do some more research.
There's always more to find out. Always more digging around to be done, that's for sure. And so one of the things I was interested in is, about the provenance, obviously, and how this is supposed to have come from the scaffold, because I think I remember reading somewhere that her clothes were supposed to have been burnt, so that she wasn't made a martyr to the Catholic cause. So it's fascinating to think that if this did come from Mary Queen of Scots, how it was spirited away and kept safe.
Well, we don't have any proof or linking it to Mary, but it has been said that Mary gave small personal items to her servants on the day before her death. But obviously then you've got slight mix in the story of how, if she gave it the day before, how could she wear it at her execution? So we're not quite sure how it survived, but a previous conservation report stated that there was staining around the neck, and in brackets it goes, old blood ? Okay. So the chemise did have a stain which a conservator in 1985 believed could be blood.
And it's never been tested since?
No, in the 70s and 80s, conservators had a practice of cleaning objects. So one of our reports actually suggests that the chemise should be cleaned, washed, and properly bleached, which is not something we would do nowadays.
Right.
So it could be that it was stained, but a historic conservation treatment has removed that, which is why the National Trust and the museum sector as a whole is very strongly advocating whatever conservation work we do must be reversible. We must always be able to get it back to how it was before any work was undertaken to stop any loss of history.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there is no evidence of that staining today. That's completely been taken out by this bleaching process.
You can still see a very faint brown stain on the shoulder, but it's not as strong as it could perhaps have been historically.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so you've talked a little bit about the scientific tests, but there's obviously no way of proving this was from Mary herself. Although I think I might have read somewhere that the linen has undergone some testing and is shown to be from that period. Is that right, or have I got the wrong end of the stick there?
Yes, it has been dated from the middle or to late 16th century, and the pattern's consistent with other garments from that period. Okay. So we know that historically it is from the Tudor period, but we just can't strongly link it to Mary outside of the inscription and the staining that has occurred.
Just one of those wonderful mysteries, isn't it, that you just would really love to be able to solve.
But I think it makes a nice talking point for visitors when they come to Coat and Court to wonder if this is an actual object that was worn by Mary Queen of Scots, and the fact that the family believed that it was and acquired it to go with their other Catholic treasures to display the strength of their Catholic faith.
Perhaps you could tell our visitors where to find you and, when you're open to the public and when they may come along and see some of these treasures.
So Coton is just outside Ulster, so on the Birmingham Road, the A435, so very easy to find. It's very welcoming to all our visitors, but we are open from March until November.
Okay,
so 1st of March we reopen, ready to tell the story of the Throckmorton family.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Philippa, for telling us today about the possible chemise belonging to Mary, Queen of Scots. So what do you think? Did the chemise belong to Mary? Did it survive the burning of her clothes? I'll leave that to you to ponder while we play another very short little ditty. And this is by Thomas Welks, called 4 Hands, 2 Necks and 1 Wreathing, would you believe? So that happy little ditty leads us into the last part of the show today. And this is where I chat with one of my fellow bloggers or Tudor enthusiasts about their favourite Tudor place to visit. And today I'm going to be talking with Rebecca Larson from Tudors Dynasty. Now, Rebecca will introduce herself in a moment, but today we are going to be travelling to another one of my favourite locations. Yes, I do have a lot. And that is Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. So let's hear from Rebecca. So hello, Rebecca. Welcome to the Tudor Travel Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I know this is our first time actually speaking, so I think it's a bit of a thrill for both of us, isn't it?
It really is. I'm very excited to speak with you today.
So this part of the podcast is all about talking to other bloggers and Tudor enthusiasts about their favourite places to visit. And we'll do that in a moment. And I know you've got a real beauty to talk about today. But first of all, for those people who don't know you, maybe you just want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your blog, Tudors Dynasty.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Well, my name, like Sarah said, is Rebecca Larson. I am the owner of TudorsDynasty.com, which is a blog I've been running for just over 3 years now. When I first started blogging, I really kind of started with the scandals and the drama of Tudor court, because that's really what intrigues most people about the Tudor dynasty. Mm-hmm. And so from there, it just has kind of evolved over time into different interests in the time period. And so now, of course, my biggest interest is Thomas Seymour, because I'm working on my first book about him. And so everything Thomas Seymour, I'm sure my followers on Tudors Dynasty on the Facebook page and Twitter are getting tired of hearing me talk about him. But you know how it is when you're passionate about something, that's just what you want to talk about. And he has really become my passion. I also have been doing a podcast. It'll be 3 years in February that I started doing my Tudors Dynasty podcast. And so throughout this whole process, I have met so many amazing people like yourself, where we can talk about what we truly love to talk about and not feel ashamed or embarrassed that we're nerds. And that's
no apologies required.
Right. And that's what I love so much about our community, is that everybody is so welcoming and willing to discuss things in a friendly manner and not name calling and such.
Absolutely. And so actually you've given us a few clues there about where we might be thinking about and talking about today, to do with Thomas Seymour. So where are we going to be looking at? What's your favourite Tudor location, Rebecca?
Sudeley Castle.
Hey! Probably one of the most beautiful locations, I think, that you could have chosen.
You know, I obviously I haven't been there yet, and I cannot wait to go one day. But from all the pictures and videos that I've seen, it is absolutely marvelous. The landscape looks beautiful. The building itself is stunning, and the history behind it is amazing. So I'm really excited to talk about it today.
So what do you think is the thing that, I mean, obviously you love Thomas Seymour, and Thomas, of course, is associated with Sudeley Castle. He moved there with Katherine Parr, didn't they, for the last few months of her life?
Yeah.
You know, why Sudeley over many of other locations you could have chosen?
It's funny, probably because that's where Katherine Parr died. That was his last big residence. And to me, I look at that as that was going to be their happy place together. Mm-hmm. And in a sad twist of fate, it didn't work out for them that way. And so when I think of Sudeley, I think of all of what could have been with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do we know of how Sudeley came into Thomas's ownership, and do we know anything about how he prepared to go and live there with Katherine? What do we know about all of that, and what's interesting to you there?
Well, he obtained Sudeley Castle in February 1547 after his nephew, Edward VI, came to the throne. And at that point, he was not yet married to Katherine Parr. But of course, as we all know, it was not long after that the two married secretly. And when she became pregnant with their daughter, Mary, I think they had kind of prepared for that to be the location where they wanted to start their family and hold their, pseudo-royal courts, a second kind of Tudor court.
Because it's very different, isn't it, one of the things that when you do visit Sudeley, it's in the beautiful Cotswold countryside, which is one of the most picturesque areas in England. And the castle is surrounded by these lovely, lush, rolling hills. And when you go, it's so peaceful. And I often think, wow, I can see why he may have wanted to spirit his wife off to this location. As you say, they can hold their own court, but it would be so peaceful and tranquil, and quite a difference to all the drama that they must have been embroiled in before then.
Right. And it makes me wonder if maybe it was another way of making sure that everything went okay with her pregnancy, that she was kept calm. Of course, we don't know that for sure. But I come up with all of these theories in my head, like what a wonderful place for them to start a family in such beautiful countryside. And like you said, it's peaceful, probably less stress than in London.
Mm-hmm. And we have been talking recently a little bit, haven't we, about the buildings at Sudeley, because as you pointed out, there's quite a lot of Sudeley left, isn't there? Although some of it lies in ruins.
Right. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing to me. Maybe my history on Sudeley isn't, exactly where it needs to be yet. But when I look at that building, I want to picture what it was like when they lived there. I want to know what the halls looked like. I wanted to know what her presence chamber looked like. And that's really kind of what got me started on some of my research of Sudeley was, where was Queen Katherine Parr's presence chamber?
Uh-huh. Yeah. And so what did you find out in that story?
Well, I did a little bit of digging and, by nature, I'm kind of a researcher. And so I started looking at different videos of Sudeley to try and see if I could figure it out from descriptions that I had gotten from Elizabeth Norton's book, The Temptation of Elizabeth Tudor. And when I was looking at that book, she talks about how, it was a two stories, basically, the presence chamber with windows that went from floor to ceiling, and it looked out into the gardens. And when I was watching these drone videos of Sudeley, I just kept looking at it going, well, here are where the gardens are. Now, of course, I'm not 100% certain that they were always there, but my gut tells me that this is the same area. So I'm looking at the castle and I'm looking, trying to find the tallest windows that I can find. They talk about how it was like standing outside when you looked out these windows. And so, in my opinion, that area is what's now in ruins.
Yeah. Because basically, so I've done a bit of research on Sudeley myself. Basically, Sudeley was a double courtyard manor house, and the privy apartments were in the second or inner courtyard. And while some of them are part of certainly the Great Hall, which used to form the South Range, and some of the East Range, where those privy apartments are, is now lost, sadly lost, destroyed during the Civil War. Part of the original chambers, privy apartments built by Richard III still survive, don't they? And that's the buildings you're talking about, those buildings that lie in ruins where you can see these beautiful windows.
Yes, and you can see where the fireplace was, and you can just imagine what that room must have looked like. You know, if it was a presence chamber for a queen, you can imagine how glorious it would have been to walk into there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you go, and hopefully some of dear listeners, many of you will have visited Sudeley, and if you haven't, you will put it on your Tudor itinerary, because those ruins are some of the most beautiful and romantic you will see. They're covered in flowers that kind of clamber over these crumbling walls, and these beautiful windows with their tracery. And as you say, Rebecca, if you try to reimagine, particularly the principal's room, like the presence chamber, and see them draped in tapestries, and you know the light pouring through the windows, that would have been quite special, wouldn't it?
Oh, magnificent. I cannot wait to go to Sudeley myself, and that's going to be one of the first places that I go to, and I just want to touch the stone.
Yeah.
You know, it seems silly, but I keep telling my husband, you know, when we finally go to England and I get to touch history, I'm probably going to be a babbling fool, because it'll just be such an emotional time for me.
I think it happens to all of us Tudor Passionistas, when we go to our place of pilgrimage, whether that's Hever or Hampton Court or Sudeley, it just reduces you to a bit of a quivering wreck, really.
I'll bring a box of tissues so that I'm prepared.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. And you talked about gardens, and for me, one of the most beautiful things about Sudeley are the gardens, because the original parterre, which was, I think, laid out in Elizabethan period, it's kind of still in place, and then you have the chapel there, and you were talking about Katherine Parr, and I suppose that's what a lot of people come to see, don't they, when they visit Sudeley, the final resting place of Katherine Parr.
I mean, how magnificent for a Tudor queen to be buried at such a private location. I mean, it's not at Westminster, it's not anywhere in London. She's out at Sudeley. I love it. I absolutely love it.
And I think I'm right in saying that she is the only English queen, maybe monarch, that is buried on private land.
I believe you're correct. Yeah.
Which makes it quite special, really.
Yeah. I wonder if the people who live out there, you know, even in that area of the country, understand how amazing it is that she's out there.
Yes, you wonder. So often what's on your doorstep you totally take for granted.
Exactly. Oh, what I wouldn't give to live in England.
Well, I'm hoping that we get to meet each other at Sudeley one day. And what do you think is the first thing you're going to do when you arrive there, Rebecca?
Kiss the wall. I'm just going to run towards the ruins and kiss it and just sit there for a while.
Oh, I think there's some lovely benches there, so you'll be able to sit in blissful peace while you imagine and reimagine the castle as it once was.
I look forward to it so much. And my husband is a photographer, so he's not as much into the Tudor history, obviously, as I am. But he loves taking pictures of, you know, ruins or abandoned buildings and stuff like that. So this will be right up his alley.
And so in terms of visiting Sudeley, obviously Sudeley is the main attraction. You must go to the chapel to see the tomb of Katherine Parr. And there's also, for those out there who are interested in making a little bit of a, you know, sort of an itinerary of it, there's nearby Hales Abbey, which was one of the smaller abbeys visited on one of the early visitations made by Cromwell's henchmen as part of the dissolution of the monasteries. That's not far away. And again, that's a really beautiful kind of romantic setting.
Yeah. Is that the one that they went to and discovered it was duck's blood?
That's exactly the one.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it's really, if you need a car to get around, I would say that, because places are out in the middle of nowhere, so you have a lot more flexibility. But if you have a car, those are two locations really close to one another. And it kind of builds a nice picture, particularly of the 1535 progress, not Katherine Parr related, but of course related to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. So that's another dimension that Sudeley brings into things.
It's so wonderful. I'm so envious of your history.
So, well, do you know when you're going to be coming over, Rebecca?
Well, my original plan was this fall, but right now I'm not thinking it's going to work out for this year. So my fingers are crossed for 2020.
Well, I shall keep them crossed too, and I hope we will get the chance to meet. But thank you in the meantime for sharing your love for Sudeley with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah.
It's been a pleasure. So that was Rebecca from Tudors Dynasty. And if you want to connect with Rebecca, then do please follow her Tudors Dynasty podcast at Patreon, that's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. And you can learn more about Thomas Seymour, Rebecca's passionate project, at thomasseymoursociety.com. And then finally, of course, there's Rebecca's website, which is www.tudorsdynasty.com. So that's all for this week's episode. I do hope you've enjoyed hearing about these fascinating places and objects. And as ever, of course, if you want to keep up to date with all my goings on, do go to the website and subscribe to the blog at www.thetudortravelguide.com. There's a fabulous 23-page free colour handout for you to plan your next Tudor adventure as my thank you to you for joining our little Tudor community. So until we meet next time, happy time travelling.